Welcome to Camera Shake Podcast, episode 135, the podcast where we discuss photography, videography, and anything and everything that's got anything to do with any of that. With me, Kirsten Lutz, and since this is the last episode of 2022, I have some incredible, awesome advice for you on how to take your photography to the next level from some of the greatest photographers around today. So let's dive right in with Joe McNally, Mark Wallace, Dylan Patrick, Steve Brazill, Sean Luthwaite, Peter Morgan, Dave Williams, and a bonus tip from myself that has made all the difference to my photography personally right after this. Before we get started, let me just say a quick thank you to our sponsor, DVE Store. DVE Store's mission is to help you create better video and provide you with the tools necessary to explore your creativity. If you have any digital video equipment needs, whether that's camera equipment, audio gear or lighting, and much more, you can check them out at dvestore.com. Thanks to DVE Store for our high-def video. Now that's out of the way, let's get right into it. So we've got 7 awesome tips to take your photography to the next level in 2023. Last week's guest was none other than concert photographer and podcaster Steve Brazill. And Steve's really left us with a really awesome tip when it comes to concert photography. Concert photography is generally regarded as being quite a difficult type of photography, if you want to call it that, because you generally exist in dark environments with a lot of movement. So you're in a dark venue, for example, you've got flashing lights going on stage, and you're trying to photograph a band and the musicians are moving across the stage. That's generally quite tricky. But here's the thing. Steve's number one top tip is ignore the noise. Most music photographers know they have to shoot at a high ISO, and they mentally resist that. They hit some arbitrary ISO that makes them think they can't go further. I've seen people on a Nikon Z9 or a Canon R5 say they were worried to go higher than ISO 3200. While you need to know the limits of your gear, it can almost always go way beyond what you think. Personally, I'm shooting at 6400 ISO, and I know Steve does the same. And I've, in the past, I've pushed it up to 10,000 and beyond that. And I've even shot on like older cameras, like my D750, for example, or a much older, I can't remember, like an older Nikon crop sensor camera that I used to have. I can't remember, is it the D3500 or 5600, something like that. Anyway, but I used to crank the ISO on that. Now, you will get noisy pictures, no question. But here's the thing. If people talk about the noise in your image, then there's usually something else wrong with the image. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. Noise, after all, isn't really that much of an issue. Just think of old black and white concert photographs that were taken on film back in the day. They're usually grainy as heck. Does it matter? Not at all, because nobody really pays any attention to the noise. In fact, sometimes it can really add to the photograph. A sharp shot with noise is almost always better than a blurry, clean shot. Of course, there are times when blur is intentional for a variety of reasons, but in general, ignore the noise and get the shot. That's an awesome tip for all of you who want to try their hands at concert photography. That's a very useful thing to remember. If you want to get into concert photography, you can start by contacting local bands, for instance, and go down to the local pub or bar, depending on where you live. A lot of music venues around locally, they're usually very dimly lit. That's a perfect training ground for your concert photography for sure. If you can shoot in there, you can shoot in any proper venue, without a doubt. Open mic nights are a really good example as well. So find yourself an open mic night. They seem to be springing up left, right, and center around here. If you find one in your area where you live, go and check that out. Stand-up comedy events are just as useful. It's a very similar thing, although often you have the comic just stood still at the mic stand, but some people move around. So a very useful environment to practice as well. So top tip from Steve Brazill right here: ignore the noise. So this takes us to tip number 2 from none other than headshot and property photographer Dylan Patrick. When thinking about flash and adding light to an image, any image, try and replicate where the light would be naturally coming from. Now, this is really something that I see a lot that's being almost like ignored in photographs. Let's say you're adding a speed light to your shot. It makes sense to place this speed light in a place where it basically replicates the natural light. So usually light has direction. So usually light would come from the left, from the right, from the top, from a 45-degree angle, wherever. You can read the shadows if you want to find out where that light's coming from, and then place your studio strobe or your flash in a place where you're basically replicating that direction of light. That will make for a much more naturally lit image. That doesn't mean that you can't add, another light somewhere to lighten up the shadows, or, place a reflector, so from the opposite side. It doesn't mean that you can't shape the light. But generally speaking, if you're trying to boost the light in an image with a flash or with a strobe, you want to place that in a position where it basically replicates the original direction of light. That's a super awesome tip. Something that I think is often forgotten about. But if you're starting out with using strobes or speed lights or any of that artificial light sources, then that's a really, really good thing to remember. It's a top tip. Tip number 3 is from portrait and headshot photographer Sean Luthwaite. In fact, Sean's given us sort of a 3-parter. Number 1 is don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you learn. Absolutely 100%. You've got to make mistakes in order to figure out where you've gone wrong, and that will make you a better photographer. Talk and distract your subject. Make them forget and feel relaxed in front of the camera. We've spoken about this particular issue on this podcast several times in the past. This really is a thing when you're doing headshots or you're shooting humans. Basically, most people are not used to being in this unnatural situation of having studio strobes pointing at them, softboxes around, reflectors, a big camera lens in their face, and so on. So people will naturally be nervous. So it's a really good idea to just distract them from thinking about all this stuff around them, and just make them feel comfortable and more relaxed. That way you'll be guaranteed to get much better pictures. People just don't look great when they look like a deer in headlights. And lastly, give them compliments on how they're doing in the session, but be honest, because people like to be told how they're doing. So that's a really important thing. It's really important to remain confident and positive, and even if you're basically, even if you're giving them overly positive feedback, you can always then, carry on taking more shots just by saying, oh, I wonder what it would be like if you moved your head this way or that way, or moved your chin up or down or whatever. And, even if you haven't really cracked it yet and you haven't really gotten to that one super awesome hero shot just yet, that's a great way to just make them feel comfortable and self-assured, and carry on with taking more pictures, so that they lose their nerves and remain relaxed. Okay, tip number 4 from tech guru Peter Morgan. So this is a bit of a tech tip. So Pete says, if you can, keep your computer backup and your picture backup separate. Losing your latest pictures, if you have to restore your system back to a certain point, is a pain at best and business critical at worst. I couldn't agree more. If you are looking at backing up your system data or your photographs, be sure to check out the episode that we did with Peter Morgan a few weeks ago. There's some super useful tips in there as to how to back up your computer, how to back up your images. But keeping those two things separate is a really great tip. So you could use separate hard drives or separate partitions, and then back something up to the cloud, for instance. But keep those things separate, because if you lose one, that, then it doesn't have an impact on the other. So if you're losing all your images, well, that's bad. But at least your computer is still up and running. If your computer goes down and you still have all your images in a separate place, well, that's even better, because it just means you just switch out your computer and you can carry on working as per usual. So, split these things up, and we'll have many more tech-related tips from Peter coming up on the Camera Shake podcast on a more regular basis. So that'll be super, super interesting. But yeah, keep your system data and your photographs separate. So next up, we're going to interrupt our regular programming for a few minutes, because we have a brand new segment to the show, and that's called What's Dave Up To Now? We're going to be following Dave Williams around on his latest adventure called Due North 2. He's back on the road to the Arctic Circle and beyond, and we're going to be following him on the Camera Shake podcast to see what he's up to. And in this little bit, he's got some awesome tips on how to keep your photography going, how to keep your gear going in the extreme cold. If you are in the US at the moment, I know you're experiencing some super, super low temperatures. So there'll be some top information in this tip for you. But also over here in the UK, we've just come through a really, really bitterly cold snap. So, and the winter isn't over yet. So there's probably more to come. So here's Dave Williams with some awesome tips on how to stay warm and keep your gear functioning in the extreme cold.
Hello, Camera Shake podcast. I'm Dave Williams, and I'm in Finnish Lapland. Right now, to be very specific about where I am, this is the Ulas ski resort. I believe it's the largest ski resort in Lapland. Not 100%, but I think that's true. And there's my van, Kofi Fernweh, which I drove here from the UK, just over 2,000 miles. There is not many people on the ski slope today. There's a bit of a whiteout, as you can see with the snow in the trees behind me. Today it is snowing and overcast. Fun fact, the sun does not rise here right now. So this is what is called polar night. So what that means is the sun doesn't come above the horizon. And I think the next time it does come above the horizon is early to mid-January at this location. But after here, I'm going to be going further north, where the sun will rise later than that. You can follow along with my social channels, YouTube and Instagram specifically, but there's also a Facebook group where I share some 360 images, mostly drone 360 images of where I am, and you can see sort of more behind the scenes of what I'm up to. So what I'm doing is called Due North 2, because last year I did Due North, where I went to Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden and Finland, but this year it's focusing on Norway, Sweden and Finland. So after here in Finland, I'm going to be heading up into Sweden to Kiruna, Abisko, which is Swedish Lapland, and then up to northern Norway to Troms, to Lofoten, and some awesome stuff's going to happen. Last night, right here, the Northern Lights kicked off, and it was my first Northern Lights show of the year. It was very, very impressive after a slow start, and I managed to get some real-time footage. This is the real-time footage right here. And as you can see, it was quite a show. So, questions about photography in the cold, because that's what it's all about for me. It's all about photography, and it's all about the cold. So the most important thing to do, I'm sorry by the way if there's a bit of squeaking, it's the sound of the snow under my feet. I'll stand still for a minute. Photography in the cold is a different thing. It's a difficult thing. The main concerns come from extreme cold with our electronics, particularly with moisture incursion. So we have to keep our electronics warm, particularly the batteries. The batteries in the cold are not rated basically to work. So if we keep them warm with some heat packs, or by keeping our gear warm in between shooting, then we're going to have much better photography. And keeping the camera warm, we also keep ourselves warm, wearing the right clothing, lots of layers to trap the air and heat the air in between the layers down to our skin. basically stay warmer for longer, and therefore we enjoy it for longer, and it gives us more opportunity to be creative in our photography rather than to just be too cold to be able to do anything. That's very important. If we're too cold, then we can't focus on the photography, we can't focus on the creativity, and therefore we don't have fun and we don't produce great photos and great videos. So the top tip for keeping the batteries warm is to use heat packs, or to have lots of batteries and keep them in pockets close to our skin. And then there are other problems that come from the cold and the changes of temperature which affect our lenses. So in the side door of my van, right by the side door, is where I keep my photography bags. And when I'm out in the cold, obviously the lens gets very cold, and just like on a cold day when you go indoors, if you wear glasses, your glasses will steam up, your lenses will do that as well. If you go straight into the van, straight into somewhere warm with that cold glass. The best way to deal with that is to put your lens and your entire camera into a camera bag. Camera bags tend to be quite well insulated, and therefore there is no sudden shock to warmth for the lens and for the camera. It can gradually acclimatize through the insulation of the camera bag, and that mist either doesn't happen or takes longer to happen. There's a slower change in temperature from the extreme cold to the warmth. Speaking of extreme cold, there's a thermometer on the building up there, and it says it's -13 here. Because I'm high up on the fell, there's a temperature inversion. These clouds here are trapping in the temperature because, as we know, heat rises, and the temperature inversion means that it's warming up here compared to down the road that way, where the town is of Ecaslompolo, where it's about -20. It's not a great difference in height, but because we're up on the fell, we're at the highest point just there, that temperature inversion traps the heat in here, making it very slightly warmer. That's interesting to know if you're going to a cold place for photography. Have a little bit of reading about temperature inversions. So, thanks for having me. I'm going to pop back often to give you updates and where I'm up to on, what I'm up to and where I am. It's going to be a little bit behind, so as I said, check out my socials for more up-to-date information. And thank you very much, Camera Shake Podcast. I'll see you again soon.
And there we are. That was Dave Williams telling us about his latest adventures up in the far north, and how to keep your gear functioning in the extreme cold. So let's move on to tip number 6 from Adorama TV's very own Mark Wallace. In fact, we've just been following Dave Williams in his van, but Mark's also built out a Land Rover, and he's on the way to Mexico and Central America. So we're going to be following him as well to see what he's up to, because if you remember a year or two ago, he was on tour on his motorbike, crisscrossing continents left, right, and center, and circumnavigating the Earth basically whilst taking photographs. Super interesting thing. In fact, Mark was on the show a little while ago, and if you haven't seen it yet, I put a link up here somewhere. Check that out. That was a super interesting thing because we met up with him when he was somewhere in Central America, as far as I remember. But he's on his latest adventure, so we're gonna, like I said, we're gonna be following as well. But Mark's sent in a few really interesting tips as well. Again, a bit of a multi-parter. But this has to do with some practical tips as far as camera settings are concerned. Now, here's tip number 1. If you need to shoot indoor photos, use these settings. Use shutter priority mode at 1/60th of a second, ISO 400, on-camera flash set to TTL or auto, a medium lens something around 35mm, or a 24-70 zoom set around 35. That's actually that's a really cool tip. And it says, that's it, shoot and you'll get great photos. If you have white walls, point your flash up or at a 45-degree angle, the light will be softer. That's actually, again, that's a really great tip. I do that a lot when I shoot events, especially indoor events. Especially when you have relatively low ceilings or white ceilings or white walls. You can, if you imagine if you have a flash on top of your camera, you can swivel the flash at and you can point that towards the wall, for example, and you get a much softer, slightly more directional light, and it looks a lot more natural because, again, as we've discovered earlier, light has direction. And by pointing a flash directly at your subject, you get these really flashy deer in the headlight type of vibes going. That's, nobody wants that. So swivel your flash at, point it either at the ceiling and get like a really, almost like a beauty. I can't talk today. It's just come out of Christmas. Well, anyway, a beauty light type of effect, or point it at the wall and you can use the wall basically as a massive reflector. So the light will get softer because you're now using a wider or bigger surface to reflect the light off, and it will have direction because it'll come from the side rather than from the top of your camera. So that's a really useful thing. 35mm, by the way, is a really great focal length to use indoors. It's a little bit wider than what we would normally perceive, and so it gives us a slightly wider, a wider view, which especially when we're indoors, works really well. Because otherwise, if you're shooting with a 50 or at 70mm or something like that, everything starts to look very hemmed in. That is, of course, unless you want to take detail shots, in which case, those are great focal lengths to use. But if you want to capture a scene indoors, 35mm is pretty much perfect. Anything wider than that will start to introduce distortion into the frame. And especially when you have humans in the shot, then that could be a problem because what happens then, you're then distorting faces and heads and body parts and so on and so forth, and that probably doesn't look great. Definitely not very flattering. So 35mm is a really good focal length to use indoors. Right. Mark's second tip is, for better looking portraits, use your longest zoom lens. Stand back and zoom in. Get as far as your subject as possible, or get as far from your subject as possible, while still filling the frame with your zoom. That will help reduce distortion, give you a better looking background, and put your subject at ease. If your photos are blurry, use a faster shutter speed and add a tripod. So the idea here is that if you're taking let's say a headshot or a close-up portrait, that you use something like a 70-200 set somewhere in the 160-200mm region, roughly. What that means is you're going to have to stand fairly far away from the subject, but it'll really blur out the background. It'll compress the background really, really well, and you get a really nice blurry bokeh. And what it does is it basically allows your subject's face to just pop out of the frame, which is great. The other thing it does is it's at that focal length, it's really flattering for your subject's face. So it basically reduces distortion to the point where the facial features come across as really flattering. So that's a really good tip. The other lens I use regularly for headshots, for instance, is an 85, because I personally like what an 85mm does to facial features. It doesn't create that soft of a background, but again, for a studio portraiture, a 35 and 85 works really well as well. And Mark's final tip when it comes to camera settings is this: shooting a dark event, holiday party, or wedding reception, use these settings. Add an on-camera flash or speedlight. Set your speedlight to TTL. So TTL is through the lens metering, and what it does is it basically means that essentially the flash works out how much power it needs to use to properly expose the scene. So you don't have to worry about whether your flash is not powerful enough or too powerful, and it takes that worry away from you. So you set it to TTL. And you can be pretty certain, depending on, whenever you change any of the other settings on your camera, your flash will then counter-regulate and make sure that everything's properly exposed. So TTL can work really well. If you find, because you're bouncing your flash, off the ceiling or off walls, or whatever, or using a flash bender from Rode, for example, Rogue even, that's very useful as well. You can always add more power to the TTL. So you could set it to TTL +1 or TTL -1. And you still have the ability to to adjust it to your liking. But in principle, basically, the flash is taking care of it by itself, which is great. Anyway, so keep your speedlight pointing forward, don't tilt. Set your camera to rear curtain sync and switch it to shutter priority mode and use a shutter speed of 1/15 of a second at ISO 800. Now, what that does is a shutter speed of 1/15 of a second may appear relatively slow, but what's actually happening is that the flash itself exposes the movement or freezes the movement. And so you don't necessarily have to worry about it too much. ISO 800 is very useful because the higher you crank up the ISO, the less power your flash needs to compensate. And that means that your batteries last a lot longer, trust me. Because that's the one thing with speed lights, they're usually powered by 4 AA batteries. And you can get through those batteries relatively quickly if you run it at full power. So even if you double your ISO on your camera, and that means you're using half the power on the flash, and that can make a massive difference. And with modern cameras today, it really doesn't matter. I mean, you can shoot at ISO 800, absolutely no problem. Your picture's going to come out fine. Maybe 10 years ago that would have been a problem, but nowadays, absolutely no worries. You can even crank it up to 1600 if you feel the need to. Again, you're just going to save battery power on your flash, and therefore you can take more shots, and therefore you don't have to switch out the batteries as often. Super awesome tip, works really well. I do all the time. So there we are, some super awesome tips from Mark Wallace that will get you through most situations, and again, some super helpful tips when it comes to camera settings. Hopefully we'll have Mark on the show in the not too distant future, because as I said earlier, he's on the road through Central and South America at the moment, and we should be following that, and we'll update you on how he's getting on with that. Now, let's move on to tip number 7, our last tip for today, by none other than the master of inner Zen, Joe McNally. Joe's tip is a really interesting one because it doesn't really have very much to do with photography per se. It's got more to do with how you conduct yourself in order to keep all the moving pieces under control. When you do a photo shoot, no matter whether it's in the studio or whether you're on location, there are lots of things that you have to have under control, and everything happens fast and everything happens at the same time. So Joe's tip is this: even when things are not going well, demonstrate patience behind the lens. Patience with the subject, with any technical difficulties of the moment, with the crew, with yourself. It will come around. Always take a beat, be positive, and then get your eye back in the lens and drive forward. This is such a powerful tip because I think we've all been in a situation, whether that's on a photo shoot or whether it's in any other situation in life, where things were seemingly getting out of control and it felt like the situation is running through our fingers like sand. And it's really important to just take a breather, take a step back, be very patient with everyone around you and with yourself, and then just take a beat, as Joe says. Be positive, always be positive, and then get your eye back in the lens, and then drive your project forward. People will thank you immeasurably for it, and that's really what makes great leadership ultimately. And when you're in control of a session or you're in control of a shoot on location with assistants and grips and models and all the rest of it, then it's really important that you can demonstrate that leadership and make people feel comfortable, because they can sense that you've got everything under control. So super top tip from Joe McNally here. I don't know anybody else who has more experience when it comes to controlling really complicated setups with lots of crew and models and loads of equipment and gear in the game. This an absolute killer of a tip, something that I will be taking, that I will be thinking about myself next time I'm in that situation. So thank you, Joe, for that awesome tip. Okay, so I've got one bonus tip left for you guys, and this is a tip from myself, because I remembered something that somebody said to me, a piece of advice that I was given a long time ago, and that is, the greatest outcomes always start with getting your butt out of bed. And nothing could be more true than that. If you think about it, there are so many, as creatives, I'm sure, we have so many different ideas of things that we could do, or things that we could make happen, or things that would be cool if, that's what, for me, that's always the thing. Wouldn't it be cool if? And it's the if that always irks me, because really it should be the when, and so I always remember that actually, in order to create a great outcome, it's really important to take the first step. And so getting your butt out of bed is usually the first step that leads to an incredible outcome. If that doesn't happen, then usually nothing else follows on from that. So, getting your butt out of bed, super awesome thing to think about. The very first episode of the Camera Shake podcast, when Nick and I first started this podcast, was called Done is Better Than Perfect. And that's really something I've lived by ever since then, because it's absolutely totally true. If you try and work out all the problems in advance and try and find a solution for every possible scenario, you're probably going to be likely to talk yourself out of a good idea rather quickly. Sometimes it's just better to just simply get started and then solve arising issues as you go along. But that's really the only way that eventually leads to a great outcome. So done is better than perfect. Get your butt out of bed if you want to create a great outcome. I don't know. It's something that has always resonated with me. It's just really important to get things moving. And if there's anything that you've been thinking about, something that's been rattling around your head, something that you thought was, is probably a good idea to be doing in 2023, then please get in touch. Let me know. I'd love to hear about your photography projects or video projects. It'd be super interesting. You can get in touch on Instagram. You can send us a DM there. You can get in touch on our Facebook group, Camera Shake Podcast, or Camera Shake Community even. You can get in touch on Twitter, provided that still exists by the time this episode comes out, or send us an email. Absolutely no problem. All the details are in the description. Let me know what you've got planned for 2023. I think it's going to be an awesome year for photography. There's so much killer stuff on the horizon, so much technology and gear that I've heard about that's going to be available to everyone to make this even more enjoyable, and it's going to help us create even more awesome photos next year. So again, get in touch. Let us know what you've got planned. Let us know where you are and where you're listening to this podcast from, because that's always interesting. And I wish you all a super awesome and successful 2023. That's all from us at the Camera Shake Podcast for today. But tune back in next Thursday. And remember, get in touch. Let us know what you're up to. Have a good one. See you next Thursday.